I'm Mangino. Welcome to the Mangino Talks Pittsburgh podcast. We talk about everything that matters to us all, from current events to Pittsburgh history, social issues to sports, politics to practical day-to-day life. And a number of these are coming into play at this point with a decision that was made by the U.S. Supreme Court. And this one is where two conservatives decided to line up with three liberals to allow the Biden administration through the ATF to continue with their regulations of what are described as ghost guns. These regulations would treat these firearms as though they are complete, legitimate firearms, even though they're ultimately kits, if you will. And we're going to talk about these regulations, the meaning of this ruling, at least temporarily, because it isn't a permanent ruling. It's just a temporary decision until the court is able to hear all of the arguments. And then what does this ultimately mean for you and me? Well, why should this even matter to us? Let's talk about that. Joining us right now on Mangino Talks is Josh Fleitman. He is CeaseFirePA's Western Regional Manager. Josh, welcome to Mangino Talks. Good to have you.
It's great to be here. Congratulations on your podcast, and always a pleasure to join you, Mangino.
Thank you very much. Your reaction to the Supreme Court and the decision by two conservative justices to line up with the three liberals to allow the Biden administration's regulations to stay in place at least for a short time?
Yeah, at first I was pleasantly surprised. I mean, I think for folks on our side of this issue, on many issues, frankly, we've not been conditioned to expect good news out of the Supreme Court of the United States recently, with some, especially on guns and gun regulations, and very dangerous and disruptive decisions they've made. So I was very pleasantly surprised at first to have this decision. But then when they actually dig down into it a little bit more, it starts to make a little bit more sense, because the two conservative justices, Amy Coney Barrett and the Chief Justice Roberts, both of whom on the most recent Second Amendment decision last summer, while they did vote with the majority, and this is the Bruin decision, they did vote with the majority to on the side of gun rights, as it were. They actually did not sign on to the more extreme opinion from Justice Clarence Thomas. Coney Barrett and Roberts wrote their own separate opinion that was a little bit more measured, a little bit less extreme. And so when you look at it from that perspective, it's not completely shocking that those were the two justices who decided to vote with the three more liberal justices in being more willing to hear out the Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms agency, the federal government here, on their case for why these ghost guns, these unassembled firearm kits should be regulated. So surprising at first, but it also does make sense at a certain point.
And so all of us completely understand this. These ghost guns, these unassembled kits that are being sold, my understanding is there's no serial number on them whatsoever at this point, and there's then no way of being able to properly track. There's no other regulation about who can buy these. Help everyone understand what the Biden administration through the ATF is wanting to continue to do, and the Supreme Court is allowing to continue until the case is ultimately heard.
Yeah, so you're exactly right. These unassembled firearm kits, commonly called ghost guns, really are, one, a rapidly growing public safety threat, and two, they really are, I mean, just a perfectly designed weapon for criminals and people who want to try to evade the attention of law enforcement. We have noticed, and this is ATF data from across the country, a huge spike in the number of ghost guns that were recovered at crime scenes by law enforcement. In 2017, there was about 1,600 ghost guns recovered by law enforcement. In 2021, just 4 years later, 19,000. So 1,600 to 19,000, huge spike in the number of ghost guns. And that's because, again, people who want to, use firearms in crimes, they know that these are a really great way to do that. As you pointed out, there's no serial number on the gun, which means it cannot be tracked and traced by law enforcement. But even probably more importantly, or equally as importantly, there's no background check required to buy these kits. And so, people who are legally prohibited from buying quote-unquote traditional firearms from gun dealers or from personal sales for handguns, because oftentimes they're convicted felons, they could buy these ghost gun kits and then assemble them in as little as 20 minutes, sometimes with some pretty basic tools, into a fully functioning gun with no serial number that can be used to shoot and kill just the same as any regular gun. And so what this regulation, this new policy through the ATF aims to do is to really recognize what that fundamental truth, that ghost guns, for all intents and purposes, are real guns. And they should be treated under the same laws and regulations and policies as real guns. So this regulation does not ban ghost guns. It allows people who are legally allowed to buy guns to buy these ghost gun kits.
Mm-hmm.
They just have to go through a quick background check to do it. And it also means the receiver, the frame on that kit, will have a serial number on it, so that if that gun is used in a crime, it can be traced back to the person who bought it, which is important because in some cases, as we've seen documented in the years leading up to this, we've seen people go into gun shows, walk out with literally duffel bags full of these ghost gun kits. Again, they bought them with no background check. And then days, weeks, or months later, those very same guns ending up being used in crimes. And so oftentimes it could be straw purchasers, it could be people illegally trafficking guns, using this ghost gun loophole to get around the basic safeguards. And so this policy, to really sum it up, is about treating ghost guns as the real guns that they are. We hope that it does get upheld fully by the courts, but we are also appreciative that the Supreme Court has allowed the ATF to continue enforcing this regulation while those other challenges work their way through the courts.
Any kind of a timeline that you were expecting for all of this to make its way back to the Supreme Court?
It would be pure speculation, to be honest. I really have no idea. Sometimes the courts can move quick. Sometimes they move very slowly. It's pretty hard to tell.
Okay. Does this also include the issue of 3D printed firearms?
On its face, no. This is really about the kits. But there is state-level equivalent policy that CeaseFirePA, my organization, does support to put in place similar regulations at the state level on ghost guns and 3D printed guns as well.
Speaking of the state level, what are you hearing at the state level from lawmakers, both sides of the aisle, House, Senate, and maybe even the governor's office, regarding statewide regulations dealing with ghost guns the same way they would any other firearm?
So actually, Governor Shapiro, in his capacity as Attorney General before he became governor, made this issue of ghost guns one of his top issues. His office was the one that did that kind of observation and sting operation of that gun show, where they made that direct connection. His agents witnessed, gun traffickers going into this gun show and coming out with bags full of ghost guns. So he has been a great leader on this.
Mm-hmm.
There is legislation in the House and the Senate that has not yet come to a vote, but we are pushing for a vote, at least in the House at first, because we have made great progress in the House with a one-vote gun safety majority. We had actually passed, just in this past May, two pieces of life-saving legislation, a universal background check bill and an extreme risk protection order bill, often called a red flag law. Those passed out of the House with bipartisan support in the spring. They're now in the Senate. There's other bills going into the House as well. So we are seeing Harrisburg, much more so than last year, mobilizing to take action and to address this gun violence crisis.
There are those that say that the ghost gun issue, not only is it being used in some extent for criminal activity, that there are those that have no real genuine desire to go out and commit a crime with it. They are concerned about the federal government or state government coming down with a crackdown on firearms, and they want to be able to continue to have one, to be able to protect their families and not have it be registered in their name. Your thoughts about those that would argue that there is a legitimate reason why otherwise law-abiding citizens would want to have a firearm like this?
Oh, I don't dispute that. I think under these regulations, it just simply applies the regular common sense laws we have around existing guns to ghost guns. So if you're a law-abiding person, if you can pass a background check, under these regulations, there's nothing to stop you from possessing a ghost gun.
Well, their argument is, well, if there isn't a serial number on it and there's never a record of original purchase, then if the government were to come and want to confiscate because they believe that your organization and other organizations like yours, Gifford, Brady, and others, would love to have the opportunity to come in and forcibly remove guns from people's homes, they argue that this gun is important to them because it then enables them to protect themselves and have some aspect of a weapon in case everything else were to be taken, because there would be no record of it the way that it stands right now without having a serial number.
Yeah, I mean, I think just to be totally candid with you, it's fear-mongering. I mean, there is There is no plan to go out and confiscate everyone's guns. Frankly, it's just not feasible. There's more guns than people in this country, so it's not going to happen. It's not something that my organization or really any credible organization advocates for. I think that fear is very much ginned up unreasonably by gun extremists, people who care more about protecting unfettered access to guns than they really do about protecting kids and communities, and putting in place reasonable safeguards, like not a gun registry, but a background check system that would then allow law enforcement to track and trace weapons used in crimes, to understand patterns and better crack down on straw purchasers, gun traffickers. So, the fears are completely unfounded and are just used to make people afraid and think with the non-rational side of their brain. I think the irony here is that those same gun extremists, they talk about, we need to support law enforcement, and we just need to enforce the laws in the books. But at the very same time, they systematically undermine the ATF as the law enforcement agency for our gun safety system. They, share critical data with local law enforcement who do some more investigations. There's legislation in Harrisburg that would abolish our state background check system, which is run by the state police, one of the best in the country. And so, I think that those kind of talking points are pretty clearly and transparently used to make people afraid, used to make them not see the big rational picture, and the hypocrisy, especially as it relates to, quote unquote, backing the blue and supporting law enforcement, is very easily exposed when you see the rest of their agenda.
Josh Fleitman joining us. He is the Western Regional Manager for CeaseFirePA. According to recent polling, where are voters when it comes to regulations that are not on the books but could be, like a red flag law, like a mandatory reporting of lost or stolen firearms, requiring some aspect of a background check on virtually any gun transfer? Where, according to recent polling, are the people of the state?
Yeah, it's a great question, Mangino. The good news is that, we just talked about, the gun extremists and their pretty radical agenda. They really speak for a small minority of the population. We've seen polling done from conservative Republican-led groups that show 80-90% of Pennsylvanians and Americans support things like background checks and extreme risk protection order or red flag laws. So, and that includes a lot of registered Republicans, a lot of self-described gun owners, self-described conservatives. Maybe I don't agree with them on other kinds of policies, but there is actually a huge amount of consensus in this country that appears so divided sometimes. Most people agree that this gun violence crisis has gotten completely out of hand, and that we can respect responsible gun ownership. And I think everything I've said here today is consistent with that. We can respect responsible gun ownership while also putting in place reasonable safeguards that evidence shows in states, as close as New York and as far away as, Arizona, evidence shows that these laws will save lives. And so people support it. And the problem has been that because of gerrymandering, because of the influence of the gun lobby and money in politics, and a relatively quiet majority but a very loud minority, the problem has been politicians and lawmakers not reflecting that will of the majority in their votes in Harrisburg.
You mentioned gerrymandering, and let's go to the political side of things. Do you believe that if Pennsylvania were to be an open primary state, that it could have the influence and impact necessary in order to get lawmakers to truly represent what is the collective will of the people of the state?
Here's what I'll say on that question. I mean, when it comes to the quote-unquote more moderate Republican lawmakers in Harrisburg, they'll tell us privately, hey, I'm with you on these policies. They make sense to me. I'll support you, or I do support you, but I can't be getting seen as out front on this issue. I can't co-sponsor the bill. I can't talk about it. Even if it comes to a vote, I may have to vote no, even though I'm with you, because I'm afraid of getting challenged in a primary. Because these districts, many of them are so safe when it comes to the general election, they're not thinking in terms of how can I appeal to the broadest part of the population, which again, 80-90% supports these kinds of policies. They're thinking, oh, if I'm seen as weak on guns, quote unquote, I'm going to get challenged from the right in a primary, and then I'm going to lose my office. And so, when it comes to open primaries, I don't know. Maybe you're right. I haven't honestly thought too much about that particular question, but I can tell you for sure that the logic of the primary electorate when it comes to elected officials in these safe Republican districts is very powerful, and that is, I can tell you for certain, stopping some of them from voting with us, even though their conscience says they should.
Interesting. Back to the issue of ghost guns. Do you see that same level of concern regarding any legislation that would even address these firearms and make them just be included in the same treatment as any other firearm would be, even on a state level?
To be honest with you, the issue of ghost guns, I think, has not yet risen to the level of public consciousness and political support compared to things like background checks or extreme risk protection orders. I think part of that is because, and this is going to be changing, it already is changing, part of it is because ghost guns specifically are more so of an urban and, metropolitan area issue. We're seeing, most of those recoveries and most of those crimes for ghost guns in places like Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Harrisburg, Erie.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas things like firearm suicide are already very prevalent in rural areas where we have more Republican lawmakers, and we are seeing ghost guns spread across the state. So I think as ghost guns do get more and more prevalent, and when we do see more rural and small communities, their police departments recovering these guns, finding them used in crimes from domestic violence to even suicide, I think we will start to see this mentality change. I don't think we're quite there yet, but I always have to remind, more conservative, more rural Pennsylvanians, just because you don't necessarily have nightly news, homicides like, the cities do, you actually have, in some cases, some of the highest rates of per capita gun violence in the state because of the gun suicide epidemic. Over half, or close to 2/3 of the gun deaths in Pennsylvania every year are suicides, and those mostly impact rural white men. And so this really is an issue that affects every part of the state, and that's why we advocate for lawmakers in every part of the state and citizens in every part of the state being a part of the solution.
What a sad commentary that is on the way that politicians collectively look at issues, and that even the general public to an extent. I mean, we didn't start to see the true crisis of heroin and opiates until it finally permeated every single community, regardless of race, color, creed, and wealth. Then all of a sudden, it's a new approach to dealing with the drug crisis that we have in this country. And it's a sad thing that people can't look down the road and say, I want to do what I can to prevent this from getting any worse than it is. They all have this collective will of, well, it's got to get even worse yet. And then when it gets really horrible and almost uncontrollable, then we'll start talking about legislation to go ahead and fix whatever the ailment may be.
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head in terms of one of the big issues facing our political system as a whole, and gun violence is a great example of that. And when people talk about addressing gun violence from a public health perspective, and for some people that just feels like a talking point, but what that means really is exactly what you're talking about, looking at the data, assessing from a population level what is driving, mass death and devastation, and whether it's opioids or gun violence, we have an obligation. One of the major roles of government, even for people who are skeptical of government, is to keep us safe and to protect our lives. And using a public health approach is exactly what you're talking about. Thinking about prevention, not just reacting to, a fire that has been growing and now all of a sudden has engulfed your whole house. Let's get it when the spark is first catching before it really becomes too big of an issue. And gun violence already is a huge issue by all means, but we've seen it getting worse and worse. And every single month we see the number of gun sales going up and up and up. And I want to be clear, we're not anti-gun, we're anti-gun violence, but there is a very clear correlation between the number of guns in a community and the rates of gun violence that you have. And so when people say, more guns make us safer, we have more guns than people in this country. We have by far the highest rate of civilian gun ownership in the entire world, and we have some of the highest rates of gun violence in the world. And so it's really hard to believe that more guns would make us safer when we have way more guns than anybody else and way more gun violence at the same time.
You mentioned something earlier that I think bears repeating, and it's that more people die from suicide from a firearm than from homicide from a firearm.
Yes.
Which just reinforces the need, I would think, that we have to have some aspect of a red flag law to protect people from themselves. And one of the things that I've come across in researching the issue of suicide is that the success rate is 95+% if individuals are using a firearm. Nothing else even comes close to that kind of a percentage of success. So the idea of being able to help people through this, through otherwise calls and pleas for help, the gun is so sufficient at doing what it was designed to do that you never get the opportunity to help those individuals who otherwise may very well be helped if it was available to them.
That's exactly right. You've really explained it very clearly. When it comes to gun suicide, we know it's oftentimes an impulsive decision, but there are signs that are made ahead of time. And you're exactly right. If you can remove that most lethal of means, obviously you want people to not attempt suicide in the first place.
Of course.
But if you can at least remove that firearm, they may attempt with some other means, which is much less likely to be completed. And I think that your language about helping people, that is really, really key, because being quote unquote red flagged is not about punishing people. It is not about labeling people with some kind of stigma. It's about giving them time and space to get help. And that really is what it's all about, is acknowledging that anybody can be in a crisis. You lose your job, you get dumped, you lose your house, whatever it may be. And if you have that gun readily available, you can make a very impulsive, quick decision that, as you said, is almost guaranteed to end your life.
Yes.
And so it's about helping people, not about punishing people.
Yeah, and so many of those individuals that do take their own life, there is a pretty sizable percentage of them that take others' lives first and then ultimately take their own. So you're talking about saving who knows how many lives ultimately that would come under the real category of suicide, and then the homicide that would then not take place because they just would otherwise not have them available to them and hopefully getting the help they so desperately need. Josh, as we wrap this up, where are you seeing things over the course of the next maybe 6 to 12 months in Pennsylvania when it comes to any of the legislation that we've talked about, maybe even that lawsuit out of Philadelphia regarding ghost guns and their lawsuit against the manufacturers of these 80% kits? Where do you see things going?
Well, I think sadly, to be honest, we're going to see gun deaths continue. We're going to see devastation continue. We're going to see outrage and mobilization continue as well. I don't think people are going to let up. Sadly, I think about it this way. If you look at kind of cultural change, which is really kind of what we're talking about here on the issue of guns, you look at something like gay marriage, for example. 20 years ago, it would have been unimaginable that where we are now as a country, both legally and culturally, on the issue of LGBTQ rights. Obviously, there's still controversy there, but generally we've made huge strides. When you look at guns, I think the more and more people, just like the more and more folks who had friends and family come out of the closet, the more and more people who are shot directly and survive, who are caught up in a mass shooting, who have a loved one who is caught up in a mass shooting, or who are afraid of this crisis actually hitting them, who felt this crisis, we're going to see the groundswell build and build. And I think we're going to see more and more legislation pass out of this House in Harrisburg with that slim but existing gun safety majority, and more pressure put on the Senate to follow suit.
Josh Fleitman once again joining us. He is the regional manager for Western Pennsylvania for CeaseFirePA, joining us on Mangino Talks. Josh, thank you very much for your time.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Mangino.
And thank you for listening to the show. Please be sure to click the subscribe button so you don't miss an episode. For more on me and the show, make sure you visit ManginoTalks.com. If there's a topic that you would like me to talk about or a guest that you would like me to have on, send me an email at Mangino@ManginoTalks.com. Follow me on your favorite social media platform by using @ManginoTalks. And then once you find me, please like, follow, subscribe, and share the pages with your friends and your family. And once again, thanks for listening to the Mangino Talks Pittsburgh podcast.
Talk to you. Oh, I wanna talk to you.